The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's diner like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the weight of desperation that had settled over the small industrial town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. It was November 1952, and the steel mills that had once been the lifeblood of this community were closing one by one, taking with them the dreams and livelihoods of thousands of families who had built their lives around the promise of steady work and honest wages. Inside the diner, the fluorescent lights flickered with the uncertainty that seemed to plague everything in Millbrook these days. The black and white checkered floor bore the scuff marks of countless workers' boots, men who had once filled these vinyl booths with laughter and plans for the future. Now most of those booths sat empty, their red vinyl cracked and fading like the hope that had once filled this place. Behind the counter stood a woman whose story would soon intertwine with forces she couldn't yet imagine. Her name was Claire Patterson, and she moved through the kitchen with a pronounced limp that told of old pain and newer struggles. At 28, she had the kind of weathered beauty that spoke of resilience rather than privilege, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and green eyes that held both wariness and determination. Claire had been working the evening shift at Murphy's for 3 months, ever since the textile factory where she'd sewn buttons onto workers' shirts had closed its doors forever. The diner job paid barely enough to cover rent for the one-room apartment she shared with her ailing mother. But it was honest work, and in Millbrook, honest work was becoming as rare as optimism. What Claire didn't know, as she wiped down the counter for the dozenth time that evening, was that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly foresee. A conversation she would overhear in less than an hour would set in motion events that would test every assumption she'd ever made about loyalty, family, and the price of survival in a world that seemed determined to crush anyone who dared to dream of something better. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened next, you need to know how Claire Patterson had arrived at this moment. Standing in a nearly empty diner on a rain-soaked November night, her future balanced on a knife's edge between desperation and possibility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The story of Claire Patterson began long before that fateful November evening, in the same crumbling industrial town where she now found herself fighting for survival. Millbrook had been built on the promise of American industry, a place where immigrant families could forge new lives through the honest sweat of their labor. Claire's grandfather, Thomas Patterson, had arrived from Ireland in 1898 with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief that hard work would eventually pay off. For decades, it seemed like Thomas had been right. The Patterson family had carved out a modest but respectable life in Millbrook's tight-knit community. Thomas worked his way up from a general laborer to a shift supervisor at Millbrook Steel, the massive foundry that dominated the town's skyline. With its towering smokestacks and the constant orange glow of molten metal, he married Mary O'Sullivan, a seamstress whose delicate hands could work magic with needle and thread. And together they raised 3 children in a small but sturdy house on Elm Street. Their eldest son, William Patterson, followed his father into the steel mill, but with dreams that stretched beyond the foundry floor. William was a man of quiet intelligence and fierce ambition, someone who understood that education might be the key to lifting his family into something approaching prosperity. He married Dorothy Hayes, a schoolteacher whose own family had struggled through the Depression but emerged with their dignity intact. Claire was born in 1924, during what seemed like the golden age of American industry. The mills were running at full capacity, men came home from work tired but satisfied, and families like the Pattersons could envision a future where their children might achieve things they themselves had only dreamed of. Claire's childhood was filled with the sounds of industry, the rhythmic pounding of machinery, the whistle that marked shift changes, the rumble of freight trains carrying finished steel to markets across the country. But even in those prosperous years, Claire's life was marked by struggle. When she was 7 years old, a childhood accident left her with the limp that would follow her for the rest of her life. She had been playing near the railroad tracks that ran behind her house when a loose coupling on a freight car gave way, sending a cascade of steel pipes tumbling down an embankment. One of those pipes caught Claire's left leg, crushing bone and muscle in ways that 1931 medical care couldn't fully repair. The accident changed more than just Claire's ability to walk normally. It altered the entire trajectory of her family's expectations. Where once her parents had imagined their bright, curious daughter might become a teacher or perhaps even a nurse, they now worried about more basic questions. Would she be able to support herself? Would any man want to marry a woman with such an obvious disability? Could she find work in a world that seemed to value physical perfection above all else? Claire's father, William, threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, driven by the knowledge that his daughter would need every advantage he could provide. He took on extra shifts, studied at night to qualify for supervisory positions, and saved every penny he could toward what he hoped would be Claire's future security. Dorothy, meanwhile, began teaching Claire skills that didn't require perfect mobility: cooking, sewing, bookkeeping, and most importantly, the kind of quiet strength that would allow her to navigate a world that might not always be kind to someone who was different. Despite her parents' protective instincts, Claire grew up to be remarkably self-reliant. Her limp forced her to develop other strengths: an acute intelligence, an ability to read people's motivations, and a fierce independence that sometimes worried her parents. She excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and literature. But her dreams of attending college were quietly discouraged by guidance counselors, who suggested that someone in her circumstances might be better served by learning practical skills. The Second World War brought unexpected opportunities to Millbrook, as military contracts flooded the steel mills, and suddenly there was more work than there were workers to do it. Claire, now 18, found employment at Henderson Textiles, one of several factories that had converted from civilian production to manufacturing military uniforms and equipment. Her damaged leg made her unsuitable for assembly line work, but her mathematical abilities earned her a position in the company's accounting department, where she tracked inventory and managed payroll for nearly 200 employees. For the first time in her life, Claire tasted real independence. She was earning decent money, contributing to the war effort, and proving that her disability didn't have to define her limitations. She even began dating Robert Sullivan, a young man who worked as a machinist at the steel mill and seemed genuinely unconcerned by her limp. For a brief, shining period, it seemed like Claire Patterson might achieve the kind of normal, prosperous life that had always seemed just out of reach. But the end of the war brought changes that no one in Millbrook had anticipated. Military contracts dried up virtually overnight, and factories that had been running 3 shifts suddenly found themselves struggling to fill orders for civilian goods. Henderson Textiles laid off 2/3 of its workforce, including most of the accounting department. Claire found herself back in her parents' house, watching her carefully constructed independence crumble like the aging infrastructure of the town around her. The post-war years were cruel to places like Millbrook. Newer, more efficient steel mills in other states began undercutting local production costs. Textile manufacturing moved south, where labor was cheaper and unions were weaker. One by one, the industries that had built the town began to abandon it, leaving behind empty factories and families who had invested everything in the promise of steady industrial work. Claire's father, William, tried to weather the storm through sheer determination. When his supervisor position was eliminated, he took a demotion back to the foundry floor. When hours were cut, he picked up part-time work loading trucks at a freight depot. But the stress was taking its toll on his health, and Dorothy Patterson watched with growing alarm as her husband's hair turned gray and his shoulders began to stoop under the weight of financial pressure. The breaking point came in the spring of 1950, when Millbrook Steel announced that it would be closing permanently within 6 months. William Patterson, along with nearly 1,000 other men, received a pink slip and a promise of 2 weeks' severance pay. At 54, he was too old to start over in another industry and too young to retire. The job search that followed was a series of humiliations, applications that went unanswered, interviews that ended with polite rejections, and the gradual realization that the world had moved on without him. The family's savings, carefully accumulated over 2 decades, disappeared with frightening speed. First went the small luxuries, the weekly movie tickets, the occasional dinner at a nice restaurant, the birthday gifts that had made holidays special. Then came the more painful cut selling Dorothy's wedding china, pawning William's father's pocket watch, moving from their comfortable house on Elm Street to a cramped apartment above a struggling grocery store. It was during this period of decline that Claire's relationship with Robert Sullivan came to its inevitable end. Not because he stopped caring for her, but because the economic reality of their situation made marriage seem impossibly irresponsible. How could they start a family when neither of them had stable employment? How could they commit to a future together when the present was so uncertain? The conversation where they decided to end their engagement took place on a park bench overlooking the shuttered steel mill, its empty windows staring down at them like dead eyes. Robert held Claire's hand as he explained that he'd decided to join his brother in Detroit, where the auto industry was still providing decent jobs for men with mechanical skills. He asked her to come with him, but they both knew it wasn't a real invitation. His brother's house was already crowded with relatives who'd fled other dying industrial towns, and there was no room for someone who couldn't contribute immediately to the household's survival. Claire watched Robert walk away with a mixture of sadness and relief. She had loved him in her quiet way, but she'd also known that their relationship was built on the foundation of a world that no longer existed. The Millbrook where they'd fallen in love, a place where steady work led to steady relationships, and steady relationships led to steady families, had disappeared as surely as if it had been bombed. After Robert left, Claire threw herself into the search for employment with the same determination her father had shown during his own job hunt. But opportunities for a woman with a limp in a town with few functioning businesses were virtually non-existent. She tried the remaining textile operations, only to be told that they needed workers who could stand for 10-hour shifts. She applied for secretarial positions at law offices and medical practices, but discovered that most employers preferred women who projected what they called a professional appearance. The rejection that hurt most came from the Millbrook Public Library, where she'd volunteered during high school and had hoped to find work as an assistant librarian. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian who had known Claire since childhood, delivered the bad news with obvious discomfort. The library board, she explained, had decided that they needed employees who could easily climb ladders to reach high shelves and move quickly between different sections of the building. Claire's qualifications were excellent, Mrs. Henderson assured her, but her physical limitations made her unsuitable for the position. That it was a polite way of saying that even in intellectual work, Claire's limp made her undesirable. The message was clear. In a world where jobs were scarce, employers could afford to be choosy, and they chose people who fit their image of what a worker should look like. By the fall of 1952, the Patterson family had reached what felt like rock bottom. William's unemployment benefits had run out, and Dorothy had developed a persistent cough that suggested health problems they couldn't afford to treat properly. The small apartment above the grocery store felt like a trap, with thin walls that let in every sound from the street and windows that looked out on the daily parade of Millbrook's decline. It was Dorothy who suggested that Claire apply for work at Murphy's Diner. The job didn't require standing for long periods or projecting any particular image, just the ability to take orders, serve food, and handle the simple transactions that kept a small restaurant running. The pay was minimal, barely enough to cover rent and basic groceries, but it was something. In Millbrook, something was better than nothing. Sean Murphy, the diner's owner, was a man in his 60s who had built his business during the prosperous war years and was now watching it slowly die along with the rest of the town. He hired Claire not because he was particularly generous, but because he couldn't afford to be picky. Good workers were leaving Millbrook as fast as they could, and those who remained were often desperate enough to work for wages that more prosperous towns would consider insulting. Claire's first day at Murphy's Diner was a revelation in the art of making something from nothing. The kitchen equipment was ancient, held together with wire and prayer. The menu was limited to dishes that could be prepared quickly and cheaply. The customers were mostly older men who nursed single cups of coffee for hours, treating the diner as a social club for people who had nowhere else to go. But there was something oddly comforting about the work. The routine was simple and predictable. Arrive at 5 in the afternoon. Help prepare for the dinner rush that never quite materialized. Serve the handful of customers who wandered in. Clean up afterward, and lock the doors at 10 o'clock. It wasn't the life Claire had imagined for herself, but it was honest work that allowed her to contribute to her family's survival. More importantly, the diner provided her with something she hadn't realized she'd been missing: a sense of purpose that wasn't defined by other people's expectations. Her limp, which had been a source of anxiety and limitation in other work environments, was irrelevant in the diner's cramped quarters. Customers cared about whether their coffee was hot and their sandwiches were fresh, not about how their waitress walked from table to table. As autumn deepened into early winter, Claire began to develop a quiet pride in her work. She memorized regular customers' preferences, learned to anticipate busy periods, and found ways to stretch the diner's limited resources to create meals that were both satisfying and affordable. Sean Murphy, initially skeptical about hiring someone with obvious physical limitations, grudgingly admitted that Claire was one of the most reliable employees he'd ever had. But even as Claire found her footing in this new role, larger forces were gathering that would soon test her newfound stability. Millbrook's decline was accelerating, with families leaving town every week in search of opportunities elsewhere. The diner's customer base was shrinking along with the town's population, and Sean Murphy was beginning to make the kind of worried calculations that business owners make when they're trying to decide whether to fight for survival or cut their losses. Unknown to Claire, conversations were taking place in the back booths of Murphy's Diner that would soon change everything. Conversations between men who saw opportunity in Millbrook's desperation, who understood that dying towns could be profitable for those willing to exploit their weakness. Men who dealt in the kind of business that thrived in shadows and fed on the desperation of people who had run out of legitimate options. It was into this world of quiet desperation and hidden danger that Claire Patterson carried her simple dreams of survival and dignity. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to intersect with forces that would test everything she thought she knew about right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, and the price of keeping the people you love alive when the world seems determined to let them die. The rain that hammered against Murphy's Diner on that November night was washing away more than just the day's accumulated dust. It was washing away the last remnants of the old Millbrook, preparing the ground for something new and potentially dangerous to take root. And Claire Patterson, limping through her evening routine with the quiet determination that had carried her through every challenge life had thrown at her, was about to discover that sometimes survival requires choices that no one should ever have to make. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversation that would change Claire Patterson's life began at exactly 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in November, though she wouldn't realize its significance until much later. She was refilling the coffee pot behind the counter when two men entered Murphy's Diner, their expensive overcoats dripping with rain and their polished shoes clicking against the worn linoleum with the authority of people who were accustomed to being noticed. Claire had learned to read customers quickly during her months at the diner. These weren't the usual patrons, unemployed steelworkers nursing dollar coffees until closing time, or elderly widows stretching a piece of pie across an entire evening for the company. These men moved with the confidence of money, settling into the corner booth with the practiced ease of people conducting business. They preferred to keep private. The older of the two was Vincent Caldwell, a name that carried weight in Pennsylvania's industrial circles, even though most people in Millbrook wouldn't have recognized him on sight. Caldwell was in his late 50s, with silver hair combed straight back, and the kind of manicured hands that had never touched factory machinery. His companion was younger, perhaps 40, with the lean build and careful eyes of someone who handled the details that men like Caldwell preferred not to think about too carefully. Claire approached their table with the professional neutrality she'd perfected over months of serving customers whose troubles were usually written plainly on their faces. "Evening, gentlemen. What can I get for you?" Caldwell ordered coffee, black, and a slice of apple pie. His companion, who introduced himself only as Mr. Davis, asked for the same but pushed his pie around his plate without eating, his attention focused entirely on the conversation they'd come to have. "The situation is exactly as we discussed," Caldwell said in a voice pitched low enough that Claire had to strain to overhear from her position behind the counter. "The town council is desperate. They'll accept any proposal that promises jobs and tax revenue, no matter how unconventional the business model might be." Claire felt a familiar chill of unease. Over the past month, she'd noticed an increase in hushed conversations at Murphy's Diner, meetings between men who didn't look like they belonged in Millbrook's dying industrial landscape. Sean Murphy had mentioned that the diner was becoming popular with out-of-town business types, but he'd seemed more interested in their money than their motives. Davis pulled a manila folder from his briefcase and spread several documents across the table. Even from her position 15 feet away, Claire could see official-looking papers covered with signatures and stamps. "The zoning permits are already approved," Davis continued. "Local law enforcement has been informed about the nature of our operations and the importance of maintaining discretion." "And the workforce?" Caldwell asked, accepting a refill of his coffee without acknowledging Claire's presence. "That's where things get interesting," Davis replied, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made Claire's skin crawl. "Unemployment in this area is running close to 60%. People are desperate enough to work for wages that would be unacceptable in more prosperous regions. More importantly, they're desperate enough not to ask questions about what exactly they're facilitating." Claire's hands trembled slightly as she wiped down tables that were already clean, trying to process what she was hearing. The men were discussing Millbrook's economic desperation as if it were a resource to be exploited, talking about her neighbors and friends as if they were commodities to be purchased at discount prices. Caldwell unfolded what appeared to be an architectural drawing, pointing to various sections with his pen. "The main facility will be constructed on the old Henderson textile site, isolated enough for privacy, but with sufficient infrastructure to handle our logistical requirements. We're estimating initial employment of about 40 people, with the potential for expansion if the operation proves profitable." "What kind of facility?" Davis asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Officially, a private medical research clinic specializing in experimental treatments for chronic pain and addiction," Caldwell replied smoothly. "Unofficially, a processing and distribution center for pharmaceutical products that occupies something of a gray area in current federal regulations." Claire felt her blood turn cold as the implications became clear. These men weren't discussing legitimate business development. They were planning to bring some form of illegal drug operation to Millbrook, taking advantage of the town's economic desperation to establish a criminal enterprise. Disguised as medical research, the conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The clinic would recruit patients from other regions, promising experimental treatments for conditions that conventional medicine couldn't address. These patients would serve as both test subjects and unwitting participants in a distribution network that stretched across multiple states. Local employees would be hired for seemingly legitimate positions: security guards, maintenance workers, administrative assistants, but their real function would be to facilitate operations that existed in the shadowy intersection between legal medicine and illegal commerce. The beauty of the scheme, as Caldwell explained it, was that most employees would never fully understand what they were helping to accomplish. The key, Caldwell emphasized, is maintaining plausible deniability at every level. Local workers know only their specific responsibilities. Patients believe they're receiving cutting-edge medical treatment. Even local officials can honestly claim they approved permits for a legitimate medical facility. Davis nodded approvingly. And if federal investigators ever show interest, we have months of paperwork documenting our research protocols and patient outcomes. Everything appears completely legitimate on the surface. As the men prepared to leave, Caldwell left a $10 tip on a $4 check, the kind of conspicuous generosity that bought silence more effectively than threats. We'll be conducting interviews for key positions starting next week, he told Davis. I want people who are desperate enough to be grateful, but intelligent enough to handle complex responsibilities without asking inconvenient questions. After they left, Claire stood behind the counter with her mind racing. She'd stumbled onto information that could potentially destroy her community, but she had no idea what to do with it. Who could she tell? The local police chief, who apparently had already been informed about the operation? The town council members who were presumably so desperate for economic development that they'd approved permits without proper investigation? More troubling was the realization that many of her neighbors, friends, and possibly even her own family might soon be faced with job opportunities that seemed like salvation but were actually invitations to participate in criminal activity. In a town where legitimate employment had virtually disappeared, how many people would be willing to look too closely at the source of a steady paycheck? The next morning brought news that seemed to confirm Claire's worst fears. Sean Murphy arrived at the diner with a copy of the Millbrook Herald, its headline announcing medical research facility to bring 40 jobs to local economy. The article was exactly the kind of positive coverage that Caldwell had undoubtedly arranged, full of quotes from grateful town officials and vague descriptions of innovative treatments for underserved patient populations. Looks like our luck might finally be changing, Sean said as he unlocked the diner's front door. 40 jobs might not sound like much to people in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, but around here, it's the difference between this town dying completely and maybe having a future. Claire watched her boss's hopeful expression and felt sick to her stomach. Sean Murphy was a good man who'd given her work when no one else would, but he was also exactly the kind of person who would convince himself to overlook suspicious details if it meant saving his business and his community. Throughout the morning, customers filtered in with excited conversations about the new medical facility. People who hadn't expressed optimism about anything in months were suddenly speculating about job opportunities and the possibility that their children might not have to leave Millbrook to find decent employment. Mrs. Kowalski, an elderly Polish woman whose husband had died in the steel mill accident 3 years earlier, ordered breakfast and stayed to chat about the possibility of finding work as a cleaning lady at the clinic. I don't understand all this medical research, she confided to Claire, but I know how to keep a building clean, and they must need people like that. Jimmy Torres, a 22-year-old who'd been laid off from the last operating textile mill 6 months earlier, stopped by for coffee on his way to what he hoped would be a job interview. My cousin said they're looking for security guards, he told Claire excitedly. Finally, something that might use my military training for something. besides collecting unemployment checks. Each conversation drove home the same painful reality. Millbrook's residents were so desperate for economic opportunity that they were prepared to embrace any possibility of employment, regardless of the questions that more prosperous people might ask about a medical research facility that appeared overnight with unlimited funding and vague explanations of its actual purpose. Claire found herself trapped between competing loyalties that seemed impossible to reconcile. On one hand, she possessed information that could potentially protect her community from becoming unwitting participants in criminal activity. On the other hand, exposing that information might destroy the first real hope her neighbors had experienced in years. The moral complexity became even more personal when her own mother raised the subject over lunch. Dorothy Patterson had heard about the clinic from Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store and wondered if Claire might be interested in applying for an administrative position. They're apparently looking for people with bookkeeping experience, Dorothy said, her voice carrying more enthusiasm than Claire had heard in months. It would pay almost twice what you're making at the diner, and it sounds like the kind of respectable work that might lead to something even better. Claire stared at her mother across their small kitchen table, seeing the hope in Dorothy's eyes and knowing that crushing that hope might be the cruelest thing she could do. Her mother's cough had gotten worse over the past month, but they couldn't afford to have it properly examined by a doctor. The extra income from a clinic job could mean the difference between proper medical care and hoping that whatever was wrong would resolve itself. "I'll think about it, Mama," Claire said carefully. "But you know how these things go. They probably want people with college degrees or special training." Dorothy reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "You're smarter than most people with college degrees, Claire. And you've got something else that's just as important. You're honest and hardworking. Employers notice things like that." The irony of her mother's words hit Claire like a physical blow. Honesty and hard work were exactly the qualities that would make someone valuable to Vincent Caldwell's operation, but not in the way Dorothy Patterson imagined. An honest, hard-working employee who didn't ask inconvenient questions was precisely what a criminal enterprise needed to maintain its facade of legitimacy. That evening, as Claire walked home from the diner through Millbrook's empty streets, she felt the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on her shoulders. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the metallic smell of dampness and decay that seemed to characterize everything about her dying town. She paused at the corner of Main and Elm, looking toward the abandoned steel mill that dominated Millbrook's skyline like the skeleton of some massive prehistoric creature. For most of her life, those towering smokestacks had represented security and prosperity, even if she'd never personally benefited from the mill's success. Now they stood as monuments to broken promises and abandoned dreams. But perhaps, Claire thought, that was exactly what made Vincent Caldwell's scheme so insidious. He wasn't preying on communities that had other options. He was targeting places like Millbrook, where people had been pushed so far beyond their limits that they might accept any lifeline, regardless of where it led. The question that haunted Claire as she climbed the stairs to her family's small apartment was whether she had the right to destroy that lifeline, even if she knew it was connected to something rotten. Did moral principle justify condemning her entire community to continued poverty and decline? Or was there some way to warn people about the dangers without destroying their chances for economic survival? As she quietly opened the apartment door, trying not to wake her sleeping parents, Claire realized that she was facing the kind of choice that would define not just her own character, but potentially the fate of everyone she cared about. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than anything she'd ever carried, including the physical burden that had shaped her life since childhood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new information about Vincent Caldwell's plans for Millbrook. But tonight, Claire Patterson lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how a limping cook in a dying town had suddenly become the keeper of secrets that could save or destroy an entire community. The decision to investigate Vincent Caldwell's operation came to Claire Patterson not as a moment of heroic resolve, but as a gradual recognition that she couldn't live with herself if she remained passive while her community walked blindly into danger. 3 days after overhearing the conversation at Murphy's Diner, she found herself standing outside the Millbrook Public Library at 7 in the morning, waiting for Mrs. Henderson to unlock the doors. Claire had spent those 3 sleepless nights wrestling with questions that seemed to have no good answers. Every option felt like a betrayal of someone she cared about. If she exposed Caldwell's scheme, she might save her neighbors from unwittingly participating in criminal activity, but she would also destroy their first real hope for employment in years. If she remained silent, she would be complicit in whatever harm the operation might cause, both to the community and to the unknown patients who would be exploited by the fake medical research. The compromise she'd reached was unsatisfying, but seemed like the only path forward. She would gather more information before making any decisions. Perhaps there were details she'd misunderstood, or maybe there was some way to warn people without destroying their economic opportunities entirely. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian who had rejected Claire's job application months earlier, seemed surprised to see her former volunteer waiting at the entrance. "Claire, dear, what brings you here so early?" "I'm doing some research," Claire replied, which was true enough. "I wanted to look up information about medical research facilities and how they operate." The Millbrook Public Library was a Carnegie building from 1902, with high ceilings and tall windows that had once made it feel grand and important. Now, with its depleted collection and aging fixtures, it felt more like a monument to better times. But it still maintained subscriptions to major newspapers and had a small collection of medical and scientific journals that might contain useful information. Claire settled into a corner table, with back issues of the Journal of the American Medical Association and several newspapers from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. She had no medical training, but her experience with bookkeeping had taught her to read documents carefully and look for discrepancies that might reveal important information. What she discovered over the next 4 hours was both reassuring and deeply troubling. Legitimate medical research facilities were heavily regulated by federal agencies, required to maintain detailed records of their research protocols, and subject to regular inspections by multiple government departments. The approval process for experimental treatments typically took years and involved layers of oversight designed to protect both researchers and patients. Vincent Caldwell's clinic, by contrast, had appeared in Millbrook with remarkable speed and minimal documentation. The newspaper article announcing its arrival contained no specific information about research objectives, funding sources, or regulatory approvals. The facility was described only in the vaguest terms as specializing in innovative treatments for chronic conditions. More disturbing was what Claire found in back issues of newspapers from other regions. Over the past 5 years, similar medical research facilities had appeared in economically distressed communities across the Midwest and South. Several had been shut down by federal investigators, with their operators facing charges related to fraud, illegal drug distribution, and exploitation of vulnerable patients. In each case, the pattern was remarkably similar to what she'd observed in Millbrook: facilities that appeared suddenly in desperate communities, offering employment to local residents while serving patients who traveled from distant locations. The legitimate-sounding medical research was invariably revealed to be a cover for operations that existed somewhere in the gray area between experimental medicine and criminal enterprise. Armed with this information, Claire decided to conduct her own surveillance of the old Henderson Textile Building where Caldwell planned to establish his clinic. The abandoned factory sat on the outskirts of Millbrook, surrounded by empty lots and accessible only by a single road that made it ideal for operations that required privacy. Over the next week, Claire developed a routine that allowed her to observe the construction work without drawing attention to herself. She would finish her shift at Murphy's Diner, then walk home through a route that took her past the textile building. What she saw there confirmed her worst suspicions about the true nature of Caldwell's operation. The construction crew was installing equipment that seemed inconsistent with medical research. Instead of the clean rooms and laboratory facilities that would be necessary for legitimate pharmaceutical work, they were building what appeared to be a combination warehouse and processing facility. Loading docks were being expanded to accommodate large truck deliveries, and the electrical system was being upgraded to handle industrial-scale machinery. Most telling was the security system being installed. Legitimate medical facilities required security to protect valuable research materials and maintain patient privacy. But Caldwell's clinic was being equipped with the kind of comprehensive surveillance and access control systems typically found in high-security government facilities or maximum-security prisons. Claire's investigation took a dangerous turn when she decided to get closer to the construction site. Using her knowledge of the area from childhood explorations, she found a position in the woods behind the building where she could observe work activities without being detected by the security cameras. From this vantage point, she watched as workers installed equipment that was definitely not medical in nature. Chemical processing vats, industrial mixing equipment, and packaging machinery suggested that whatever was being produced in this facility would be manufactured in large quantities rather than developed through careful research protocols. Final piece of evidence came when Claire witnessed a late-night delivery that removed any remaining doubt about the facility's true purpose. A truck with out-of-state plates arrived after midnight, carrying crates that were unloaded under heavy security and moved directly to a basement area that had been constructed with reinforced concrete walls. The precautions taken during this delivery: armed guards, radio communication, immediate concealment of the cargo were inconsistent with legitimate medical supplies, but perfectly consistent with the kind of valuable contraband that required protection from both law enforcement and competing criminal organizations. As Claire made her way home through Millbrook's empty streets, she carried with her the crushing weight of certainty. Vincent Caldwell's medical research facility was exactly what she'd feared: a sophisticated criminal operation designed to exploit her community's desperation while using their economic need as protection against investigation. But knowledge, she was learning, could be its own form of torture. Now that she knew the truth, she was faced with the impossible task of deciding what to do with it. The people of Millbrook were already beginning to benefit from the clinic's presence, even before it opened. Local contractors were earning money from the construction work. Suppliers were getting orders for equipment and materials, and dozens of families were preparing for job interviews that might provide their first steady income in years. The complexity of her situation became even more apparent when Claire stopped by the post office the next morning and encountered Tommy Rodriguez, a young man she'd known since high school. Tommy had been one of the brightest students in her graduating class, someone who'd dreamed of becoming an engineer, but had been forced to abandon college when his father was killed in an industrial accident. "Claire, I heard you might be applying for work at the new clinic," Tommy said, his face bright with excitement. "I just finished my interview for a maintenance supervisor position, and I think it went really well. They said they need people who understand industrial equipment and can work independently." Claire felt sick as she realized that Tommy's engineering background and mechanical aptitude made him exactly the kind of employee who would be valuable to Caldwell's operation. His intelligence and technical skills would help the facility run efficiently, while his desperation for legitimate work would prevent him from asking inconvenient questions about what he was helping to maintain. "That sounds promising, Tommy," Claire managed to say. "What kind of equipment will you be working on?" Tommy's expression grew slightly puzzled. They weren't very specific about that. "Something about specialized pharmaceutical manufacturing equipment," that requires careful calibration. They said I'd receive additional training after I start, but the important thing is having a strong background in mechanical systems. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Tommy describing how the clinic job would allow him to marry his girlfriend and maybe even return to school part-time to finish his engineering degree. Claire listened with growing horror as she realized that Caldwell wasn't just exploiting Millbrook's economic desperation. He was specifically targeting the community's most capable and ambitious young people, the very individuals who might otherwise lead efforts to rebuild the town's legitimate economy. That evening, Claire found herself facing a decision that could no longer be postponed. Her mother had scheduled a job interview at the clinic for the following Monday, and several of her neighbors had already received offers for positions that would begin as soon as the facility opened. Time was running out for any intervention that might prevent good people from becoming unwitting accomplices to criminal activity. The conversation she'd been dreading finally occurred over Sunday dinner, when Dorothy Patterson raised the subject of Claire's own potential employment at the clinic. "I spoke with Mrs. Kowalski after church this morning," her mother said, "and she mentioned that they're still looking for someone to handle payroll and basic accounting. You'd be perfect for that kind of work, Claire." William Patterson, who had been growing increasingly frail as his unemployment stretched into its third year, looked up from his plate with more interest than he'd shown in anything for months. "Accounting work would be perfect for Claire," he agreed. "And if it pays, as well as people are saying, it might mean we could afford to see a doctor about your cough, Dorothy." Claire stared at her parents across their small kitchen table, seeing the hope in their eyes and knowing that her next words might crush the first optimism they'd experienced since the steel mill closed. But she also knew that she couldn't allow her mother to walk unknowingly into a situation that might destroy not just her family, but their entire community. "Mama, Papa," she began carefully, "I need to tell you something about this clinic. Something I learned that makes me think it might not be the kind of place where we want to work." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Claire's life. She explained what she'd overheard at Murphy's Diner, what her research had revealed about similar facilities in other towns, and what she'd observed during her surveillance of the construction site. She watched her parents' expressions change from excitement to confusion, to a kind of resigned despair, as they processed the implications of what she was telling them. Dorothy Patterson was the first to speak when Claire finished her explanation. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Claire? Because if you're wrong, you're asking us to give up the first real opportunity we've had in years." "I'm certain, Mama," Claire replied, her voice steady despite the tears she was fighting back. "I wish I wasn't, but I am." William Patterson sat in silence for a long moment, his weathered hands folded on the table in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had watched his world collapse and was now being asked to accept that even the possibility of rebuilding it was an illusion. "So what do we do now, Claire? Even if you're right about this clinic, people are going to work there anyway. They're too desperate to turn down jobs, regardless of where those jobs might lead." It was a question that Claire had been asking herself for days, and she still didn't have a good answer. But as she looked at her parents' faces, she realized that her investigation had reached its endpoint. She now possessed information that could potentially save her community from making a terrible mistake. But using that information would require courage of a kind she'd never been asked to demonstrate before. The time for passive observation and careful research was ending. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether she was willing to risk everything: her job, her family's financial security, and possibly her safety, to protect people who might not thank her for the intervention. But first, she needed to find someone who would believe her story and have the authority to act on it. In a town where local officials had already been compromised, and federal investigators were too distant to understand the urgency of the situation, that someone would be difficult to find. As Claire helped her mother clear the dinner dishes, she was already formulating a plan that would require her to venture further outside her comfortable routine than she had ever gone before. The limping cook from Murphy's Diner was about to become something she'd never imagined, a whistleblower whose actions might determine the fate of an entire community. The solution to Claire's dilemma came from the most unlikely source imaginable, a customer she had never paid much attention to, who had been sitting in the corner booth of Murphy's Diner almost every evening for the past 2 weeks. His name was Frank Sullivan, and until the moment he quietly asked her to sit down for a conversation that would change everything. Claire had dismissed him as just another unemployed mill worker drowning his sorrows in endless cups of coffee. Frank was a man in his early 40s with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in physical labor. But there was something in his pale blue eyes that suggested depths Claire hadn't bothered to explore. He always sat alone, always ordered the same thing, black coffee and a ham sandwich, and always left exact change plus a modest tip. In a diner full of men eager to share their complaints about unemployment and economic hardship, Frank Sullivan stood out for his silence. It was Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after Claire had told her parents about Vincent Caldwell's true intentions, when Frank approached the counter as she was preparing to close for the night. The diner was empty except for the two of them, and the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows that made the conversation feel more intimate than Claire was comfortable with. "Miss Patterson," Frank said, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been Boston or somewhere farther north. "I wonder if you might have a few minutes to talk about something important." Claire paused in her cleaning routine, studying Frank's expression for clues about what he might want. In her experience, late-night conversations with male customers rarely led anywhere she wanted to go, but something in his manner suggested this was different. "I'm not sure what we'd have to talk about, Mr. Sullivan," she replied carefully, "but I suppose I can spare a few minutes before I lock up." Frank gestured toward the corner booth where he'd been sitting, and Claire reluctantly joined him, keeping the table between them and positioning herself where she could quickly reach the phone behind the counter if necessary. Up close, she could see details that hadn't been apparent from a distance. The careful way he moved his left arm, suggesting an old injury. The quality of his clothes, which were worn but had originally been expensive. And most intriguingly, the small notebook he kept beside his coffee cup, filled with what appeared to be detailed observations written in precise handwriting. "I need to start by telling you who I really am," Frank said, pulling a leather wallet from his jacket pocket. "My name is Frank Sullivan, and I'm an investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I've been working undercover in Millbrook for the past 3 weeks, investigating reports of suspicious activity related to the new medical research facility." Claire felt the world shift around her as she processed this information. The quiet man she'd been serving coffee to every evening was a federal agent, and he'd been watching the same criminal operation that had been keeping her awake at night. "You're FBI?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded, showing her credentials that looked official but meant little to someone who'd never seen FBI identification before. "We received a tip from an informant in Pittsburgh about Vincent Caldwell's activities. Similar operations in Ohio and West Virginia led to federal charges, but Caldwell disappeared before we could arrest him. When we learned he was setting up another facility here in Millbrook, I was assigned to gather evidence for prosecution." The revelation that she wasn't alone in her suspicions about the clinic brought Claire a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because someone with actual authority was working to stop Caldwell's operation. Terror because the situation was apparently serious enough to warrant federal investigation. "What kind of evidence are you gathering?" Claire asked, her mind racing with implications she was only beginning to understand. Frank opened his notebook and showed her pages covered with detailed observations, license plate numbers, descriptions of individuals, times and dates of various activities. Mostly surveillance data that will help prosecutors establish patterns of criminal behavior. But what we really need is someone with inside access to the facility who can document specific illegal activities. Claire felt a chill of premonition. Inside access? Someone who could get hired by the clinic and provide information about what's actually happening there. Frank explained, "The operation is too well protected from external observation. We need evidence of the actual manufacturing process, distribution methods, and financial transactions that prove criminal intent." The request hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Claire understood immediately that Frank Sullivan was asking her to do exactly what her mother had already volunteered for, get a job at Vincent Caldwell's clinic. The difference was that instead of unknowingly facilitating criminal activity, she would be deliberately documenting it for federal prosecutors. "You want me to work there as an undercover informant," Claire said, her voice flat with disbelief. "I want you to consider it," Frank replied carefully. "You're in a unique position. You already know about the criminal nature of the operation. You have the skills they need for administrative work, and most importantly, you have compelling personal reasons for wanting employment that would make your application seem completely natural." Claire stared at the FBI agent across the small table, trying to process the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that would be? These people have already demonstrated that they're willing to corrupt local officials and operate sophisticated criminal enterprises. What makes you think they wouldn't kill someone who they discovered was working with federal investigators?" Frank's expression grew grave. "You're absolutely right about the danger. This isn't something I would ask lightly, and it's not something you should agree to without understanding the risks. But I also need you to understand what's at stake if we can't stop this operation." He pulled out a manila folder and spread several photographs across the table. The images showed facilities similar to Caldwell's clinic in various stages of operation and destruction. This is what happened in Youngstown, Ohio, when local residents discovered they'd been unwittingly helping to manufacture methamphetamine disguised as experimental pain medication. 12 people died in the explosion when someone tried to destroy evidence. This is what we found in Wheeling, West Virginia, when we finally raided a facility that had been operating for 2 years. The second set of photographs showed the human cost of Caldwell's operations. Patients who had been used as test subjects for dangerous drug combinations. Families who had lost everything when breadwinners were arrested for unwitting participation in criminal activity, and communities that had been left more devastated than before the facilities arrived. "The pattern is always the same," Frank continued. "Caldwell targets economically desperate communities, establishes operations that appear to provide legitimate employment, then disappears when federal heat gets too intense. He leaves behind people who face prosecution for crimes they didn't understand they were committing, and communities that are worse off than before he arrived." Claire studied the photographs with growing horror, seeing in them a preview of what might happen to Millbrook if Caldwell's operation was allowed to continue. "How long before you have enough evidence to shut him down?" "That depends on how well protected his operation is," Frank admitted. "External surveillance can only tell us so much. We need documentation of the actual manufacturing process, evidence of interstate drug distribution, and financial records that prove criminal intent. Without inside access, it could take months or even years to build a prosecutable case." The timeline made Claire's blood run cold. In months or years, dozens of Millbrook residents would be working at the clinic, becoming increasingly dependent on income that came from criminal activity. By the time federal investigators finally moved against Caldwell, her entire community might be so compromised that distinguishing between willing participants and unwitting victims would be impossible. "What exactly would you need me to do?" Claire asked, surprised by her own question. Part of her couldn't believe she was even considering Frank's request, but another part recognized that this might be the only way to save her community from the disaster she'd witnessed in those photographs. Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private despite the empty diner. Get hired for an administrative position that gives you access to financial records and shipping documentation. Document everything you can about the facility's actual operations. Most importantly, identify the key personnel and gather evidence about the distribution network they're establishing. He paused, allowing Claire to absorb the implications of what he was describing. I won't lie to you about the risks. If they discover what you're doing, they won't hesitate to eliminate the threat you represent. But you would have federal protection, and your information could save not just Millbrook, but other communities that Caldwell might target in the future. Claire sat in silence for several minutes, weighing options that all seemed to lead toward disaster. If she refused Frank's request, she would have to watch helplessly as her neighbors became unwitting accomplices to criminal activity. If she accepted it, she would be risking her life and potentially the safety of her family. I need time to think about this, she finally said, and I need to discuss it with my parents. They have a right to know what I'm considering, especially since it could affect their safety too. Frank nodded understandingly. Of course. But I should mention that time is becoming a factor. The clinic is scheduled to open next Monday, and they're conducting final interviews for key positions this week. If you're going to do this, you'll need to apply within the next couple of days. As they prepared to leave the diner, Frank handed Claire a business card with only a phone number written on it. If you decide to help us, call this number and leave a message saying you're interested in discussing employment opportunities. I'll contact you within 24 hours with specific instructions. Claire pocketed the card, feeling its weight as if it were made of lead rather than paper. Agent Sullivan, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why did you choose to approach me? There must be other people in Millbrook who could potentially help with your investigation. Frank's expression grew thoughtful. I've been watching this community for 3 weeks, Miss Patterson. I've seen how people react to economic pressure, how they rationalize accepting opportunities that seem too good to be true. Most folks here are so desperate, they'd convince themselves that any job was legitimate, regardless of the evidence to the contrary. He paused, studying Claire's face in the harsh fluorescent light. But you've been asking questions. I've seen you researching at the library, watching the construction site, having difficult conversations with your family about uncomfortable truths. You're one of the few people in Millbrook who's willing to look past immediate benefits to consider long-term consequences. Claire felt a flush of something that might have been pride, mixed with the terrifying realization that her curiosity and moral concerns had marked her as both an asset and a potential target. What if I'm not brave enough to do what you're asking? Frank. Sullivan stood and put on his coat, preparing to disappear back into the role of unemployed mill worker that had provided his cover for the past 3 weeks. Courage isn't about not being afraid, Miss Patterson. It's about doing what's right despite being afraid. You've already shown more courage than most people by refusing to accept easy answers when the stakes were this high. As Claire locked up Murphy's diner and walked home through Millbrook's empty streets, she carried with her the weight of a decision that would define not only her own future, but potentially the fate of everyone she cared about. The FBI business card felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket, a constant reminder that she now possessed the power to save or damn her entire community. The conversation with her parents that awaited her at home would be even more difficult than the one she'd had the previous week. This time, she wouldn't just be asking them to give up hope for economic improvement. She would be asking them to support her decision to risk her life in an effort to protect people who might never know about the sacrifice she was considering. But as she climbed the stairs to their small apartment, Claire realized that Agent Sullivan had been right about one thing. She had already demonstrated a kind of courage by refusing to accept convenient lies when uncomfortable truths were available. The question now was whether she could find the additional courage necessary to act on those truths, Regardless of the personal cost, the conversation with her parents about Agent Sullivan's proposition lasted until 3 in the morning and left Claire feeling more isolated than she had ever been in her life. Dorothy and William Patterson listened to their daughter's explanation with expressions that shifted from disbelief to terror, to a kind of numb acceptance that their family had somehow become entangled in forces beyond their understanding or control. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Dorothy said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "You want to apply for a job at a criminal organization, pretend to be a willing participant in illegal activities, and gather evidence that could get you killed, all to protect neighbors who don't even know they need protecting." Claire sat across from her parents at their small kitchen table, the FBI business card lying between them like a piece of evidence in its own right. "When you put it that way, Mama, it sounds insane. But what's the alternative? Let Vincent Caldwell turn our entire community into unwitting accomplices. Watch our friends and neighbors get arrested when the FBI finally moves against the operation. Hope that somehow everything works out without anyone getting hurt." William Patterson, who had remained silent through most of the discussion, finally spoke up. "Claire, I've lived through the Depression, a world war, and the collapse of everything I thought I could depend on for security. But I've never asked my daughter to risk her life to solve problems that should be handled by people with badges and authority." "But Papa, I'm the only person in a position to help those people with badges," Claire replied. "Agent Sullivan made it clear that without inside access, it could take years to build a case against Caldwell. How many communities will be destroyed? In the meantime, how many people will have their lives ruined?" The argument that followed was unlike any disagreement the Patterson family had ever experienced. For the first time in Claire's adult life, she found herself fundamentally at odds with parents whose judgment she had always trusted. Dorothy and William couldn't understand why their daughter felt responsible for solving a problem that was clearly beyond her capabilities, while Claire couldn't explain why she felt morally obligated to act when she possessed knowledge that could prevent disaster. "You're not responsible for saving the world, Claire," Dorothy said, her voice breaking with frustration and fear. "You're a 28-year-old woman with a physical disability who works as a waitress in a dying town. This is not your fight. Then whose fight is it?" Claire shot back. "The town council members who've already been bought off. The police chief who's been informed about the operation. The federal agents who are hundreds of miles away and don't understand how desperate people here have become." The conversation might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by a soft knock at the apartment door. All three Pattersons froze, suddenly aware that it was nearly dawn, and that unexpected visitors at this hour rarely brought good news. William opened the door to find Tommy Rodriguez standing in the hallway, his face flushed with excitement despite the early hour. "Mr. Patterson, I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I had to tell someone the good news. I got the job at the clinic. I start Monday morning as a maintenance supervisor, and they're paying me almost twice what I made at the textile mill." Claire felt her stomach drop as she watched Tommy's enthusiasm, knowing what she knew about his new employer. This was exactly the scenario that Agent Sullivan had warned about. Good people making decisions based on incomplete information that would eventually destroy their lives. "That's wonderful news, Tommy," Dorothy managed to say, though her voice lacked the warmth such an announcement would normally receive. "We're very happy for you." Tommy seemed to notice the tension in the room for the first time. "Is everything all right?" "I didn't mean to interrupt anything important." "Everything's fine," Claire said quickly. "We were just having a family discussion about some job opportunities that have come up." After Tommy left, the Patterson apartment fell into a silence that felt heavy with unspoken implications. Claire stared at the closed door, seeing in her mind the eager face of a young man who had no idea he was about to become part of a criminal conspiracy. The abstract moral dilemma she'd been wrestling with had suddenly acquired a specific human face, and that face belonged to someone she'd known since childhood. "You see," Claire said quietly to her parents, "it's already starting. Tommy thinks he's gotten his big break, the chance to build a real life with Maria and maybe go back to school. In 6 months, when the FBI raids that clinic, he'll be arrested, along with everyone else who works there." Dorothy Patterson looked at her daughter with new understanding. "You're not just trying to save the community, are you? You're trying to save specific people like Tommy who don't deserve what's about to happen to them." Claire nodded, feeling tears she'd been holding back for days finally begin to fall. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Kowalski, who's so excited about finding work as a cleaning lady, and Jimmy Torres, who thinks his military training finally found a purpose, and Tommy, who sees this job as his chance to escape poverty and build something good." William Patterson reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "Claire, what you're considering is incredibly dangerous. If something happens to you, your mother and I will have lost the most important thing in our lives. Is saving other people worth that risk?" It was the question Claire had been asking herself since Agent Sullivan first made his proposition, and she still didn't have a good answer. Was her moral obligation to her community greater than her responsibility to her family? Did the potential to prevent widespread harm justify the risk of personal destruction? "I don't know, Papa," she admitted. "But I know I can't live with myself if I do nothing and watch good people get destroyed by something I might have prevented." The decision, when it finally came, wasn't the result of heroic resolve or calculated risk assessment. It was the product of exhaustion and the recognition that all of her options involved some form of betrayal. If she refused to help Agent Sullivan, she would be betraying her community and her own moral convictions. If she accepted his proposition, she would be betraying her parents' reasonable desire to keep their daughter safe. "I'm going to do it," Claire said as the sun began to rise over Millbrook's empty streets. "I'm going to apply for a job at the clinic and try to gather the evidence Agent Sullivan needs." Dorothy Patterson closed her eyes and took a deep breath before responding. "Then we're going to help you prepare for it. If you're determined to risk your life for other people, at least we can make sure you're as ready as possible for what you're walking into." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt surreal in its mixture of mundane details and life-or-death implications. Claire called the number Agent Sullivan had given her and left the coded message about employment opportunities. Within 12 hours, she received a phone call with instructions for a meeting that would determine the specifics of her undercover operation. The meeting took place in the back room of Kowalski's grocery, a location chosen because Mrs. Kowalski was one of the few people in Millbrook who could be trusted to provide privacy without asking questions. Agent Sullivan arrived with a briefcase full of documents and equipment that would help Claire maintain her cover while gathering evidence. "The position you'll be applying for is administrative assistant to the financial director," Sullivan explained. "It's perfect for our purposes because it will give you access to both operational documents and accounting records. You'll be able to document cash flows, supply chain activities, and personnel decisions that prove criminal intent." He showed Claire a small recording device disguised as a fountain pen, a camera hidden in what appeared to be a compact mirror, and an emergency communication system that would allow her to contact federal agents if she found herself in immediate danger. "The most important thing to remember," Sullivan emphasized, "is that you're not trying to be a hero. Document what you can, gather evidence when it's safe to do so, and get out immediately if you sense that your cover has been compromised. We can always build a case against Caldwell later, but we can't replace you if something happens." Claire's job interview at the clinic was scheduled for Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after she'd first overheard Vincent Caldwell discussing his plans at Murphy's Diner. The circular nature of the timing wasn't lost on her as she prepared for what might be the most important performance of her life. Dorothy Patterson helped her choose clothes that would project competence without calling attention to her disability, while William offered advice about how to answer questions in ways that would seem honest while concealing her true motivations. The family dynamic had shifted in ways that none of them fully understood. Instead of being the daughter who needed protection, Claire had become the focal point of an operation that required their collective support and courage. "Remember," Dorothy said as Claire prepared to leave for the interview, "you're not just Claire Patterson anymore. You're someone who desperately needs this job and is willing to overlook minor irregularities to get it. Don't be too eager, but don't be too suspicious either." The walk to the clinic felt like the longest journey of Claire's life, even though the distance was less than a mile. Each step took her further from the safety of her known world and closer to a realm of danger and deception that she was wholly unprepared to navigate. But with each step, she also carried the weight of responsibility for people like Tommy Rodriguez and Mrs. Kowalski, people who deserved better than to have their hopes used against them by predators like Vincent Caldwell. The clinic building looked even more impressive up close than it had during her surveillance activities. The renovation of the old textile factory had been completed with remarkable efficiency, creating a facility that projected exactly the kind of medical authority that would reassure both patients and employees. Only someone who knew what to look for would notice the subtle signs of deception: security systems that were too sophisticated for legitimate medical research, loading docks designed for discreet cargo movement, and windows that were too small and too few for a facility that claimed to prioritize patient comfort. As Claire approached the main entrance, she took a deep breath and tried to transform herself into the person she needed to be, a desperate woman who saw this job as her salvation and was prepared to ignore inconvenient questions in exchange for economic security. It was a role that required her to suppress her natural curiosity and moral concerns, replacing them with the kind of willful blindness that allowed good people to become accomplices to evil. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whisper, and Claire Patterson walked across the threshold that separated her old life from whatever was about to begin. Behind her lay the world of Murphy's Diner, family dinners, and small-town struggles that were difficult but comprehensible. Ahead lay a realm of federal investigations, criminal conspiracies, and moral complexities that would test every assumption she'd ever made about courage, loyalty, and the price of doing what was right. As she approached the reception desk to announce her arrival, Claire carried with her the prayers of her parents, the training of federal agents, and the hope that somehow she might be able to save her community without destroying herself in the process. The decision had been made, the die cast, and there was no turning back from whatever consequences awaited her. On the other side of Vincent Caldwell's carefully constructed facade, the interior of Vincent Caldwell's clinic was a masterpiece of calculated deception, designed to project medical authority while concealing industrial-scale criminal activity. Claire Patterson walked through polished corridors lined with motivational posters about healing and recovery, past reception areas decorated with soothing artwork and comfortable seating, toward an administrative wing that hummed with the quiet efficiency of legitimate business operations. Her interview was conducted by Margaret Winters, a woman in her mid-40s who wore the kind of conservative business attire that suggested decades of experience in healthcare administration. Margaret's office was appointed with medical journals, certificates from pharmacy schools, and photographs that showed her receiving awards from various professional organizations. Only someone trained to look for deception would notice that. The certificates were slightly too new, the photographs slightly too generic, and the medical journals still bore the crisp appearance of publications that had never been read. "Miss Patterson," Margaret said, reviewing Claire's hastily prepared resume, "your background in bookkeeping and accounting makes you an excellent candidate for our administrative assistant position. We're particularly interested in finding someone who understands the importance of confidentiality in medical research." Claire nodded earnestly, playing the role of someone desperate enough for employment to accept any job without asking inconvenient questions. I understand completely, Mrs. Winters. I've always believed that patient privacy is sacred, and I would never do anything to compromise the important work you're doing here. The questions that followed were designed to assess not just Claire's qualifications, but her willingness to maintain the kind of willful ignorance that Caldwell's operation required. Margaret asked about her comfort level with complex financial arrangements, her ability to work with diverse patient populations, and her understanding that medical research sometimes required unconventional approaches to traditional problems. Each euphemism sent chills down Claire's spine as she recognized the coded language that would allow employees to rationalize participation in criminal activity. Financial complexity meant money laundering, diverse patients meant drug addicts from multiple states, and unconventional approaches meant manufacturing illegal substances disguised as experimental medicine. We're particularly interested in hiring local people, Margaret continued. Individuals who understand the economic challenges facing this community and appreciate the opportunities that our clinic represents. We believe that when employees have personal stakes in the success of our operations, they're more likely to maintain the kind of loyalty and discretion that medical research requires. Claire understood the implicit threat in Margaret's words. Local employees would have family and community ties that could be leveraged to ensure their cooperation. If anyone considered betraying the operation, their loved ones would suffer the consequences along with them. I absolutely understand, Claire replied, thinking of Tommy Rodriguez and Mrs. Kowalski, and the dozens of other Millbrook residents who would soon be trapped in the same web of economic dependence and moral compromise. This job represents a new beginning for my family, and I would do everything in my power to protect that opportunity. The interview concluded with Margaret offering Claire the position at a salary that was indeed nearly double what she'd been earning at Murphy's Diner, along with health benefits that would allow her family to address her mother's persistent cough. The generosity was calculated to create exactly the kind of financial dependence that would make employees reluctant to risk their positions by asking uncomfortable questions. You can start Monday morning, Margaret said, handing Claire a packet of employment documents. Your immediate supervisor will be Dr. Harrison Blackwood, our Director of Financial Operations. He'll orient you to our accounting systems and explain the specific requirements of your position. Claire left the clinic with mixed emotions of triumph and terror. She had successfully infiltrated Caldwell's operation, but now she faced the infinitely more dangerous task of gathering evidence, while maintaining her cover among people who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her true purpose. Weekend that followed was spent in intensive preparation for what Agent Sullivan had warned would be the most challenging phase of the operation. Claire practiced using the recording device disguised as a fountain pen, learned to operate the camera hidden in her compact mirror, and memorized the emergency protocols that would allow her to contact federal agents if her cover was compromised. More importantly, she worked with her parents to develop a communication system that would allow them to monitor her safety without drawing attention to unusual behavior. Dorothy Patterson would visit Murphy's Diner every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, ostensibly to have coffee with Sean Murphy, but actually to receive coded updates about Claire's status. If Claire failed to appear at the diner by 7 o'clock on any given day, or if she used specific phrases during their conversations, Dorothy would contact Agent Sullivan immediately. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray, drizzling rain that seemed to characterize all of Millbrook's most significant moments. Claire dressed in the conservative business attire that Margaret Winters had recommended, concealing her recording equipment in pockets and accessories that would allow her to document conversations without arousing suspicion. The transformation from waitress to administrative assistant required more than just changing clothes. Claire had to adopt an entirely different persona, suppressing the natural curiosity and moral conviction that had driven her investigation in favor of the kind of compliant professionalism that would make her valuable to criminal employers. Dr. Harrison Blackwood turned out to be a thin, nervous man in his early 50s who projected the kind of intellectual authority that would reassure patients while concealing the fact that he was actually coordinating a sophisticated money laundering operation. His office was located in the clinic's administrative wing, surrounded by filing cabinets and computer terminals that processed the financial transactions necessary to maintain Caldwell's facade of legitimacy. "Miss Patterson," Dr. Blackwood said, gesturing toward a desk that had been positioned to give her access to both filing systems and computer records. "Your primary responsibility will be maintaining our patient accounts and processing payments for experimental treatments. You'll find that our billing procedures are somewhat more complex than traditional medical practices, but I'm confident you'll adapt quickly." The complexity that Dr. Blackwood described became apparent as Claire began reviewing the clinic's financial records. Patients were charged enormous fees for experimental treatments that were actually doses of illegally manufactured drugs. These payments were processed through a labyrinthine network of shell companies and overseas accounts that disguised the true source and destination of the money. Even more disturbing was the patient roster, which included individuals from across the Midwest and South who had been recruited through advertisements promising miracle cures for chronic pain, addiction, and terminal illnesses. These desperate people were paying thousands of dollars for treatments that not only failed to address their medical conditions, but actually made them worse by creating new dependencies on illegal substances. Claire's first week at the clinic provided her with a comprehensive education in the scope and sophistication of Caldwell's criminal enterprise. The operation was far more extensive than Agent Sullivan had initially suspected, involving multiple facilities, hundreds of unwitting patients, and distribution networks that stretched across at least 6 states. Working in Dr. Blackwood's office gave Claire access to shipping manifests that documented the movement of chemical precursors necessary for drug manufacturing, personnel files that revealed the backgrounds of key operatives, and financial records that proved the operation's criminal intent beyond any reasonable doubt. Most shocking was the discovery that several apparently legitimate medical facilities in other states were actually part of Caldwell's network, using their credentials and reputation to recruit patients and launder money through seemingly respectable healthcare transactions. The psychological strain of maintaining her cover while documenting these discoveries proved almost unbearable. Claire spent her days typing invoices for treatments that destroyed lives, filing shipping documents for chemicals that would become street drugs, and processing payments that represented the life savings of desperate families who believed they were purchasing hope. Every interaction with her coworkers required careful calculation to maintain the persona of someone who was grateful for employment and uninterested in asking inconvenient questions. She had to express enthusiasm for the clinic's success, while secretly documenting evidence that would eventually destroy the lives and careers of people who treated her with professional courtesy and personal kindness. That Dr. Blackwood proved to be particularly challenging to deceive because his nervousness made him hypervigilant about potential security threats. He watched Claire's work with the intensity of someone who understood that discovery would mean not just professional ruin, but possible imprisonment or death. "Miss Patterson," he said during her second week, "I hope you understand that the work we're doing here requires absolute discretion. Our research methods are proprietary, and there are competitors who would do anything to steal our innovations." Claire nodded earnestly while using her fountain pen to record his explanation of why employees were forbidden from discussing their work with outsiders, why certain areas of the facility were off limits to administrative staff, and why all communications with government agencies had to be approved by management before being sent. The most dangerous moment came during her third week, when Claire discovered a filing cabinet that contained detailed records of the drug manufacturing process. The documents provided exactly the kind of evidence that Agent Sullivan needed to prove criminal intent, but accessing them required Claire to work late after other administrative staff had gone home. She was photographing the most incriminating documents when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside Dr. Blackwood's office. Claire quickly returned the files to their proper locations and pretended to be working on routine billing when Vincent Caldwell himself appeared in the doorway. "Miss Patterson," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the same smooth authority she remembered from his conversation at Murphy's Diner. "Working late, I see. That's exactly the kind of dedication we value in our employees." Claire felt her heart hammering as she realized she was face to face with the man whose criminal operation she was working to destroy. "Yes, sir. Dr. Blackwood asked me to finish processing some patient payments before tomorrow morning." Caldwell studied her with pale eyes that seemed to see through her carefully constructed facade. For a terrifying moment, Claire wondered if her cover had been compromised, if somehow her investigation had been discovered, if she was about to pay the ultimate price for her decision to help Agent Sullivan. "You know, Miss Patterson," Caldwell said finally, "Dr. Blackwood tells me you've adapted remarkably well to our procedures. He's very impressed with your discretion and professionalism." "Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work here." Caldwell smiled with an expression that failed to reach his eyes. "I hope you'll consider this more than just a job. Miss Patterson, we're building something important here, something that could provide security for you and your family for years to come. Loyal employees who demonstrate their value to our organization can expect to be rewarded accordingly." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Caldwell explaining how dedicated employees could advance within his organization, how their families would be protected and provided for, and how loyalty would be both rewarded and expected. Claire understood that she was receiving both a job offer and a threat. Caldwell was inviting her to become a willing participant in his criminal enterprise, while making it clear that betrayal would have consequences that extended far beyond her own safety. "You can stay forever," Caldwell said as he prepared to leave the office, "as long as you remember that what we're building here depends on everyone understanding their role and maintaining their commitments." After he left, Claire sat alone in the administrative office with her hands shaking and her mind racing. She had gathered enough evidence to support federal prosecution, but she had also attracted the personal attention of a man who would not hesitate to kill anyone who threatened his operation. The next morning brought news that made Claire's situation even more precarious. When she arrived at work, Dr. Blackwood informed her that her mother had died during the night from complications related to her persistent cough, and that the clinic would of course provide time off for funeral arrangements and emotional recovery. But Claire's mother was very much alive, and the false information could only mean one thing: Vincent Caldwell was testing her loyalty by seeing how she would react to a fabricated family crisis. Her response to this test would determine whether she remained a trusted employee or became a security risk that needed to be eliminated. Claire Patterson stared at Dr. Blackwood across his desk, her mind racing as she processed the implications of what he had just told her. The fabricated news of her mother's death wasn't just a test of her emotional reactions. It was a sophisticated psychological trap designed to reveal whether she had outside contacts who might be monitoring the PEFA clinic's activities. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Miss Patterson," Dr. Blackwood continued, his nervous eyes studying her face for any sign that she knew the information was false. "Mr. Caldwell wanted me to personally convey his condolences and assure you that the clinic will provide whatever support you need during this difficult time." Claire forced herself to react as any normal employee would upon hearing such devastating news. She allowed her face to crumple with grief, let tears flow freely, and struggled to speak through what appeared to be overwhelming emotion. Every response had to be carefully calculated to seem genuine, while avoiding any behavior that might suggest she knew her mother was actually safe at home. My mama? Claire whispered, her voice breaking in what she hoped sounded like authentic shock. But I just spoke with her last night. She seemed tired, but not. How did this happen? Dr. Blackwood consulted a manila folder that Claire, suspected, contained fabricated medical records designed to support the lie. According to the information we received from Millbrook General Hospital, she experienced respiratory failure related to the chronic condition she'd been struggling with. The doctor said it happened very quickly. She didn't suffer. The cruel irony of the situation wasn't lost on Claire. She was being forced to grieve for a death that hadn't occurred while working for people who might actually kill her mother if they discovered her true identity. The emotional strain of maintaining her cover while processing this psychological manipulation threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed facade. I need to go to her, Claire said, rising unsteadily from her chair. I need to make arrangements. Contact family members. Of course, Dr. Blackwood replied smoothly. Take whatever time you need. But Miss Patterson, given the sensitive nature of our work here, I hope you understand that we'll need to coordinate any communications with outside parties. We wouldn't want confidential information about our research to be accidentally disclosed. During your time of grief, the warning was clear. Any attempt to contact federal agents or discuss clinic activities with outsiders would be monitored and potentially punished. Claire was being isolated at the moment when she most needed to communicate with Agent Sullivan about the evidence she'd gathered and the escalating danger of her situation. I understand, Claire managed to say. I just ... One need a few minutes to process this news. Dr. Blackwood's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy, though Claire suspected he was simply relieved that she was reacting in ways that suggested ignorance rather than deception. Why don't you go home for the rest of the day? We'll handle any urgent matters that come up, and you can return when you're ready to resume your duties. The walk from the clinic to her family's apartment was the longest journey of Claire's life. Every step took her further from the safety of her undercover role and closer to a confrontation that would determine whether her cover remained intact or whether Vincent Caldwell had discovered her true purpose. She found her mother sitting at their small kitchen table, reading a library book and occasionally coughing in the way that had become worryingly familiar over the past few months. Dorothy. Patterson looked up as her daughter entered, immediately noticing the strain on Claire's face. What's wrong? Dorothy asked, rising quickly from her chair. Did something happen at the clinic? Claire closed the apartment door and checked to ensure the windows were closed before speaking. Even in their own home, she couldn't be certain. They weren't being monitored by Caldwell's security people. Mama, she said quietly, I need you to listen very carefully and not react strongly to what I'm about to tell you. Dr. Blackwood informed me this morning that you died last night from respiratory complications. Dorothy Patterson's face went pale as she processed the implications of her daughter's words. They're testing you. Yes, and I don't know how much time we have before they expect me to return to work or contact outside parties about funeral arrangements. If I don't react the way they expect, they'll know something is wrong. The next few hours were spent in careful preparation for a performance that could determine whether the Patterson family lived or died. Dorothy helped Claire practice the kind of grief-stricken behaviors that would be expected from someone who had just lost her mother, while William worked to create the appearance that funeral preparations were being made. Most importantly, they needed to maintain the illusion that Claire was following clinic protocols about outside communications. Any phone calls or meetings with people outside the family would have to be carefully orchestrated to avoid arousing suspicion about her true loyalties. The solution came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Kowalski, who had been hired as a cleaning lady at the clinic, stopped by the Patterson apartment during her lunch break to offer condolences about Dorothy's supposed death. The elderly Polish woman had heard the news from other clinic employees and wanted to express sympathy for Claire's loss. "Such a tragedy," Mrs. Kowalski said, embracing Claire with genuine warmth. "Your mother was such a good woman. If there's anything I can do to help with arrangements, or just to provide company during this difficult time, please let me know." Claire realized that Mrs. Kowalski's visit provided the perfect cover for communicating with Agent Sullivan. If clinic security was monitoring her activities, they would see exactly what they expected: a grieving daughter, receiving comfort from neighbors and making necessary preparations for her mother's funeral. "Mrs. Kowalski," Claire said carefully, "I wonder if you might help me contact the funeral home about arrangements. I'm having trouble thinking clearly right now, and I could use someone to help me make the necessary phone calls." The older woman agreed immediately, and Claire provided her with Agent Sullivan's emergency contact number, explaining that it belonged to a distant relative who needed to be notified about the death. Mrs. Kowalski made the call from her own apartment, delivering a coded message that would alert federal agents to the developing crisis without explicitly mentioning Claire's undercover status. Within 2 hours, Agent Sullivan appeared at the Patterson apartment disguised as a representative from Mitchell & Sons Funeral Home. His cover was sophisticated enough to withstand casual scrutiny, complete with business cards, price lists, and the kind of professional demeanor that would be expected from someone helping a family during their time of grief. "Miss Patterson," Agent Sullivan said, playing his role perfectly, "I'm very sorry for your loss. Mrs. Kowalski explained that you need assistance with arrangements for your mother's service." The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in coded language that would sound like normal funeral planning to anyone who might be listening. Agent Sullivan, speaking as a funeral director, asked about viewing preferences and service timing while actually gathering information about the evidence Claire had collected and the current threat level at the clinic. Claire, responding as a grieving daughter, provided details about her mother's final wishes and family preferences, while actually describing the scope of Caldwell's operation, the locations of incriminating documents, and the security measures that would complicate any federal raid on the facility. The most critical information Claire conveyed was Vincent Caldwell's personal interest in her activities and Dr. Blackwood's nervousness about potential security leaks. Agent Sullivan's expression grew increasingly grave as he realized that Claire's cover was more precarious than they had initially believed. "Miss Patterson," he said finally, "given your mother's sudden passing, perhaps it would be best if you took an extended leave from work to handle family matters. Sometimes grief can make it difficult to maintain normal professional responsibilities." Claire understood that Agent Sullivan was offering her an escape route, a way to withdraw from the undercover operation before her cover was completely compromised. But she also knew that leaving now would mean abandoning not just the federal investigation, but the Millbrook residents who were already working at the clinic and depending on their jobs for survival. "I appreciate your concern," Claire replied, "but I think Mama would have wanted me to maintain my commitments to my employer. She always believed in honoring obligations, even during difficult times." Agent Sullivan nodded grimly, understanding that Claire was choosing to continue her dangerous mission despite the escalating risks. "In that case, we should discuss the specific arrangements that would best honor your mother's memory." The coded conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Agent Sullivan providing Claire with additional emergency protocols and extraction procedures that could be activated if her situation became untenable. He also assured her that federal agents were now positioned to move quickly if the clinic's activities posed an immediate threat to public safety. As Agent Sullivan prepared to leave, maintaining his funeral director persona to the end, he provided Claire with a business card that contained hidden contact information for emergency situations. "Miss Patterson," he said, "please remember that your mother's greatest wish was for your safety and happiness. Don't let grief or obligation prevent you from making decisions that honor that wish." After he left, Claire sat with her parents in their small kitchen, processing the magnitude of what she had committed to continue. The psychological test that Caldwell had administered had been successfully navigated, but it had also revealed the sophisticated surveillance and manipulation capabilities of his organization. Returning to work the next morning would mean walking back into a situation where her every move was being monitored, her every relationship was being evaluated, and her continued survival depended on maintaining a performance that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. But as Claire prepared for what might be her final week at the clinic, she carried with her the knowledge that federal agents were now fully aware of the scope and danger of Caldwell's operation. Her evidence had provided them with the information necessary to move against the criminal enterprise, but the timing and method of that intervention would determine whether she survived to see justice done. The test of loyalty had been passed, but it had also revealed that Vincent Caldwell was no longer simply running a criminal operation in Millbrook. He was conducting a sophisticated counterintelligence operation designed to identify and eliminate threats to his enterprise. Claire Patterson, the limping cook who had stumbled onto his conspiracy, had become the primary target of that operation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she returned to work among people who were now actively testing her loyalty and watching for signs of deception. The psychological pressure of maintaining her cover while knowing that discovery meant death had reached a level that threatened to break even her remarkable resilience. But Claire had made her choice, and there was no safe path back to the simple life she had known before Vincent Caldwell arrived in Millbrook. The only way forward led through dangers that would test every assumption she had ever made about courage, survival, and the price of protecting the people you love. Claire's return to the clinic 3 days after her supposed bereavement was met with the kind of carefully orchestrated sympathy that characterized everything about Vincent Caldwell's operation. Flowers had been placed on her desk. Condolence cards from coworkers awaited her attention, and Dr. Blackwood greeted her with the practiced solemnity of someone who had perfected the art of appearing genuinely concerned while conducting surveillance. "Miss Patterson," Dr. Blackwood said, his nervous hands adjusting papers that didn't need adjusting, "we're all so sorry for your loss. Please know that if you need any additional time to process your grief, the clinic is prepared to be very accommodating." Claire thanked him with the subdued gratitude that would be expected from someone returning to work after a family tragedy. But she noticed immediately that the atmosphere at the clinic had changed in ways that had nothing to do with sympathy for her situation. Security personnel who had previously been invisible were now prominently stationed throughout the facility, and conversation stopped abruptly when she entered rooms where colleagues had been speaking in hushed tones. Most concerning was the presence of new personnel who carried themselves with the kind of professional alertness that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. These men moved through the clinic with clipboards and measuring devices, conducting what appeared to be a comprehensive security audit of the entire facility. Tommy Rodriguez, whom Claire encountered during her lunch break, provided the first indication of how dramatically the situation had changed her absence. The young man who had been so excited about his maintenance supervisor position now looked haggard and nervous, jumping at unexpected sounds and glancing frequently over his shoulder. "Claire, I'm glad you're back," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you've been dealing with family problems, but things have gotten really strange around here." "Strange how?" Claire asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Tommy looked around to ensure they weren't being overheard before continuing. "They've brought in these security consultants who are asking everyone detailed questions about their work routines, their family members, their financial situations. They say it's for employee safety, but it feels more like we're being investigated for something." The security review that Tommy described was exactly what Claire had feared. Caldwell's organization was conducting a comprehensive audit to identify potential security threats among their employees. Her successful navigation of the psychological test had bought her time, but it hadn't eliminated suspicion about possible infiltration of the operation. "Have they questioned you?" Claire asked. "Yesterday for almost 2 hours," Tommy replied, his face pale with anxiety. "They wanted to know about everyone I've talked to since starting work here, whether I've noticed anything unusual about the equipment I maintain, whether any of my coworkers have asked questions about things that weren't their responsibility." Claire felt her stomach clench as she realized that her evidence-gathering activities might have been more visible than she believed. Any coworker who had noticed her staying late, accessing files outside her normal duties, or asking questions about facility operations might have mentioned those observations during their security interviews. The afternoon brought confirmation that her worst fears were materializing. Margaret Winters, the administrative director who had conducted Claire's initial interview, appeared at her desk with a request that felt more like a summons. "Miss Patterson, would you mind joining me?" "In conference room B. There are some gentlemen who would like to speak with you about your work here at the clinic." The conference room contained 3 men Claire had never seen before, each wearing the kind of expensive suits that suggested they held positions of authority within Caldwell's organization. The leader was a man in his 50s with gray hair and cold eyes who introduced himself only as Mr. Davis, the same surname as the man who had accompanied Caldwell during his initial planning meeting at Murphy's Diner. "Miss Patterson," Mr. Davis said, gesturing for Claire to sit across from the 3 men. "We're conducting routine security interviews with all clinic employees. This is standard procedure for facilities that handle sensitive research materials and confidential patient information." Claire settled into her chair with what she hoped appeared to be the nervous compliance of someone who had nothing to hide but was intimidated by official questioning. "Of course, I understand the importance of protecting patient privacy and research security." The questions that followed were more sophisticated than anything Tommy Rodriguez had described. Mr. Davis and his colleagues had clearly done extensive research into Claire's background, her family situation, and her employment history. They knew about her disability, her financial struggles, her father's unemployment, and even details about her failed relationship with Robert Sullivan. "We understand you've experienced significant economic hardship over the past few years," one of the other men said, consulting a file that appeared to contain comprehensive information about Claire's personal life. "The loss of the steel mill, your family's financial difficulties, the challenge of finding employment that accommodates your physical limitations." "Yes, sir," Claire replied, wondering how much they knew and whether they had discovered anything that might compromise her cover. "This job has been a blessing for my family during a very difficult time." Mr. Davis leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more intense. "Miss Patterson, given your family's financial stress and your mother's recent death, we want to make sure you understand that the clinic is prepared to provide additional support beyond your regular salary. Loyal employees who demonstrate their value to our organization can expect significant financial rewards." The offer was clearly a test, designed to gauge whether Claire would be receptive to the kind of extra payments that typically accompanied participation in criminal activity. Her response would determine whether she was viewed as a potential asset or a security risk. "That's very generous," Claire said carefully, "but I'm grateful just to have steady work. I don't need anything beyond my regular wages." The men exchanged glances that suggested her answer was being evaluated against some predetermined criteria. Mr. Davis made a note in his file before continuing with questions that probed deeper into her activities and observations. "In your work with Dr. Blackwood, have you noticed anything unusual about our financial procedures? Any transactions or documentation that seemed inconsistent with standard medical billing practices?" Claire felt sweat beginning to form on her palms as she realized the question was designed to determine whether she had recognized the money laundering operation she'd been documenting. I've noticed that the billing is more complex than what I handled at other jobs, but Dr. Blackwood explained that research facilities have specialized requirements that are different from regular medical practices. And have you discussed these specialized requirements with anyone outside the clinic? Family members, friends, former co-workers? The question struck at the heart of Claire's greatest vulnerability. Any admission that she had discussed clinic operations with outsiders would reveal that she had violated the confidentiality requirements that were supposedly crucial to maintaining research security. No, sir, Claire replied. Dr. Blackwood made it very clear that everything about our work here is confidential. I would never compromise that trust. Mr. Davis studied her face with the intensity of someone trained to detect deception. Miss Patterson, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to understand that your answer will determine your future relationship with this organization. Have you had any contact with law enforcement agencies, federal investigators, or anyone else who might have an interest in our research activities? The moment Claire had been dreading had arrived. She was being directly questioned about the very activity that had brought her to the clinic in the first place. Any hesitation, any sign of nervousness, any inconsistency in her response would likely result in her immediate detention and possible execution. No, sir, Claire said, meeting Mr. Davis's gaze with what she hoped appeared to be honest confusion. Why would I have contact with law enforcement? I don't understand what they would want with a medical research facility. The three men continued their questioning for another 45 minutes. Probing every aspect of Claire's background and behavior for signs that she might be working with federal investigators. They asked about her research activities at the library, her walks past the construction site before the clinic opened, her conversations with other employees, and her financial records going back several years. Each question was a potential trap, designed to catch her in inconsistencies or admissions that would reveal her true purpose. Claire navigated the interrogation with responses that were truthful enough to be verifiable, while omitting the crucial details that would expose her undercover operation. The session concluded with Mr. Davis delivering a warning that was clearly intended to intimidate her into compliance. Miss Patterson, we appreciate your cooperation with the security review. I hope you understand that maintaining the confidentiality and security of our operations is not just a professional responsibility, it's a matter of personal safety for everyone involved in our work. The medical research we conduct here has significant commercial value, and there are competitors who would do anything to steal our innovations. Employees who compromise our security, whether intentionally or through carelessness, put themselves and their families at serious risk. Claire left the conference room with her hands trembling and her mind racing. The security interview had been more thorough and sophisticated than anything she had prepared for, and she wasn't certain that her cover had survived intact. Mr. Davis and his colleagues were clearly professionals with extensive experience in counterintelligence operations. More immediately concerning was the implicit threat against her family. Caldwell's organization had made it clear that any betrayal would result in consequences that extended far beyond Claire herself. Her parents, who were already living under the strain of her dangerous deception, would become targets if her true identity was discovered. That evening, Claire met her mother at Murphy's Diner for their regularly scheduled check-in, but the conversation felt different from their previous coded exchanges. Dorothy Patterson had spent the day being questioned by clinic security personnel who were investigating all family members of employees, ostensibly to ensure that no outside parties had access to confidential information. They asked me about your work habits, your personality, your financial situation, Dorothy reported quietly as they sat in the corner booth where Vincent Caldwell had first discussed his plans. They wanted to know if you'd seemed different since starting at the clinic, whether you'd discussed your job responsibilities, whether you'd had any unusual visitors or phone calls. Claire felt the walls closing in around her family as she realized that Caldwell's security review was more comprehensive than she had imagined. They weren't just investigating employees. They were conducting background checks on anyone who might have access to information about the clinic's operations. What did you tell them? Claire asked. I told them you were grateful for the job and rarely discussed work details because you understood the importance of patient confidentiality, Dorothy replied. But Claire, these people are professionals. They know how to detect lies, and I'm not sure how much longer we can maintain this deception. The conversation was interrupted by Sean Murphy, who approached their table with news that sent chills through both women. Claire, I heard about the security review at the clinic. I hope everything is okay with your job. Why wouldn't it be? Claire asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Sean's expression grew troubled. Because they've been asking questions about you around town. Specifically about whether you've had any unusual visitors lately. Whether you've been acting differently, whether you've asked anyone for help with research or documentation. The revelation that Caldwell's investigators were conducting inquiries throughout Millbrook meant that Claire's cover was under assault from multiple directions. Any evidence of her contact with Agent Sullivan, any sign that she had been gathering information about the clinic's operations, any indication that federal agents were operating in the area would expose her true identity. As Claire walked home through Millbrook's dark streets, she realized that her time as an undercover operative was rapidly coming to an end. The security review that Caldwell's organization was conducting would eventually uncover evidence of her federal connections, her research activities, or her evidence-gathering operations at the clinic. The question was no longer whether her cover would be blown, but whether she could gather enough additional evidence to ensure that federal prosecutors could move against Caldwell's operation before her true identity was discovered. The limping cook who had stumbled onto a criminal conspiracy had become the target of a sophisticated counterintelligence operation that was systematically eliminating every avenue of escape. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she returned to work among people who were actively investigating her background and motivations. The psychological pressure of maintaining her cover while knowing that discovery meant death had reached a level that threatened to break even her remarkable resilience. But Claire Patterson had come too far and risked too much to surrender now. The evidence she had gathered could save not just Millbrook, but other communities that Caldwell might target in the future. The final phase of her mission would require courage and cunning beyond anything she had previously demonstrated. But the alternative, watching her community be destroyed by people who exploited desperation for profit, was unacceptable. Unraveling had begun, but the outcome was still in doubt. The end came not with dramatic confrontation, but with a simple phone call that changed everything. Claire Patterson was filing financial documents in Dr. Blackwood's office when Margaret Winters appeared in the doorway, her face pale with an emotion that seemed to combine fear and anticipation. Miss Patterson, Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled. Mr. Caldwell would like to see you in his private office immediately. Claire felt her blood turn to ice as she processed the implications of the summons. Vincent Caldwell maintained a personal office in the clinic's secure wing, a space that employees entered only when they were being promoted to positions of greater trust and responsibility, or when they were being eliminated as security threats. Walk through the clinic's corridors felt like a journey to execution. Claire passed familiar faces: Tommy Rodriguez adjusting ventilation equipment, Mrs. Kowalski mopping floors with methodical precision, Dr. Blackwood reviewing patient files with nervous concentration. Each person represented someone whose life would be affected by whatever happened in the next few minutes. Caldwell's office was located behind two sets of security doors that required electronic keycards to access. The space itself was appointed with the kind of understated luxury that suggested both wealth and power: leather furniture, original artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a commanding view of Millbrook's industrial landscape. Vincent Caldwell stood behind his desk with his back to the door, apparently studying the abandoned steel mill that dominated the town's skyline. When he turned to face Claire, His pale eyes held an expression that was difficult to read, part admiration, part disappointment, and something that might have been genuine sadness. "Miss Patterson," Caldwell said, gesturing toward a chair positioned directly across from his desk, "please sit down. We have important matters to discuss." Claire settled into the leather chair with movements she hoped appeared calm despite the terror that was threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Everything about the situation, the private meeting, Caldwell's formal demeanor, the obvious security precautions, suggested that her cover had been definitively compromised. "I want to begin," Caldwell continued, "by expressing my sincere admiration for the skill and dedication you've demonstrated during your time with our organization. Your performance has been truly exceptional, far beyond what we typically expect from administrative personnel." The praise felt like a trap, designed to elicit some admission of guilt or acknowledgement of deception. Claire responded with the confused gratitude that would be expected from someone who genuinely didn't understand the implications of what was being said. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I've tried my best to do good work and justify the trust you've placed in me." Caldwell smiled with an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed you have. Which is why what I'm about to tell you is particularly disappointing." He opened a manila folder and spread several photographs across his desk. The images showed Claire entering the Millbrook Public Library, photographing documents in Dr. Blackwood's office, and meeting with Agent Sullivan outside her family's apartment building. "Miss Patterson," Caldwell said quietly, "or should I say Special Agent Patterson, we know exactly who you are and why you're here." The moment Claire had been dreading for weeks had finally arrived. Her cover was blown, her mission was compromised, and she was completely at the mercy of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operation. But instead of the panic she'd expected to feel, Claire experienced something closer to relief. The exhausting burden of maintaining a false identity while living in constant fear of discovery was finally over. Whatever happened next, at least she wouldn't have to pretend anymore. "I'm not a federal agent," Claire said, her voice steady. "Despite the circumstances, I'm exactly who I've told you I am, a woman who needed a job and was grateful to find one here." Caldwell studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Miss Patterson, we have photographic evidence of you conducting surveillance on our facility, documented proof of your contact with FBI personnel, and testimony from multiple sources about your research activities and unusual behavior patterns." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a tone of almost paternal disappointment. "What we don't understand is why someone with your obvious intelligence and capabilities chose to work against us rather than with us." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Claire could have anticipated. Instead of threatening her with immediate execution, Caldwell began explaining his operation from a perspective she had never considered, that of someone who saw himself as providing valuable services to communities that had been abandoned by legitimate economic systems. "Millbrook was dying before we arrived," Caldwell said, his voice carrying what seemed like genuine conviction. "The steel mill was closed, unemployment was approaching 70%. Families were leaving every week because there was no future here. We've brought jobs, economic activity, hope for people who had given up on the possibility of prosperity. But at what cost?" Claire found herself asking, momentarily forgetting the danger of her situation. "You're using people's desperation to make them accomplices to criminal activity. You're destroying the very community you claim to be helping." Caldwell's expression grew thoughtful. "And what was the alternative, Miss Patterson? Let Millbrook fade into complete economic collapse? Allow families like yours to sink into poverty while waiting for government assistance that would never come? Watch young people like Tommy Rodriguez leave for cities where they'd compete for jobs they'll never get?" The argument he was making was seductive in its logic, And Claire could see how desperate people might convince themselves that any economic opportunity was better than continued decline. But she'd also seen the photographs Agent Sullivan had shown her, the devastation that Caldwell's operations had brought to other communities when they inevitably collapsed. "You're not saving these communities," Claire said, her voice growing stronger as her fear transformed into anger. "You're exploiting them until they're no longer useful, then abandoning them to face the consequences of crimes they didn't understand. They were committing." Caldwell nodded slowly, as if her response confirmed something he'd been trying to determine. "That's exactly what a federal agent would say. Someone trained to see only the legal and moral objections to our methods without considering the broader economic and social benefits we provide." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the town spread below them. "Miss Patterson, I'm going to make you an offer that I've never made to a law enforcement officer. Join us willingly, and I'll show you how to save not just Millbrook, but dozens of communities like it across the country." The proposition was so unexpected that Claire had trouble processing what Caldwell was suggesting. "You want me to become a criminal? I want you to become a realist," Caldwell replied. "Someone who understands that moral purity is a luxury that dying communities can't afford. The economic system that built places like Millbrook has abandoned them. Government programs are inadequate and temporary. Traditional industries are never coming back." He turned to face her again, his expression earnest in a way that was more disturbing than threats would have been. "But we can provide sustainable economic activity that gives people purpose, income, and hope. Yes, our methods exist in legal gray areas, but the results speak for themselves." Claire felt herself being drawn into an argument that challenged every assumption she'd made about right and wrong, legal and illegal, helping and harming. Caldwell wasn't the caricature of evil she'd expected. He was someone who had developed a comprehensive philosophy that justified criminal activity as a form of community development. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Caldwell's expression grew sad. "Then I'm afraid we'll have to treat you as the security threat that you represent. Not just to our organization, but to the hundreds of people whose livelihoods depend on our continued operation." The threat was clear, but it was accompanied by something Claire hadn't expected: genuine regret. Caldwell wasn't a sociopath who enjoyed killing. He was someone who had convinced himself that eliminating threats was a necessary part of protecting the greater good he believed he was accomplishing. "I need time to think," Claire said. "Of course. This isn't a decision that should be made hastily." Caldwell returned to his desk and opened a different folder. "While you're considering my offer, perhaps you'd be interested in some information about your federal contact." He spread out a new set of photographs showing Agent Sullivan in various locations around Millbrook, along with documents that appeared to detail his background and mission parameters. "Frank Sullivan," Caldwell read from one of the documents. "FBI Special Agent assigned to the Bureau's Organized Crime Task Force. 15 years of experience investigating financial crimes and drug trafficking operations. Currently operating under deep cover to gather evidence for prosecution of our medical research facility." Claire felt her stomach drop as she realized that Caldwell's counterintelligence operation was far more sophisticated than she'd imagined. They hadn't just identified her as a federal informant, they had completely penetrated Agent Sullivan's cover and were monitoring his activities in real time. "Agent Sullivan believes he's controlling this investigation," Caldwell continued. "But we've been aware of his presence since the day he arrived in Millbrook. Every piece of evidence you've gathered, every communication you've had with federal authorities, every plan for prosecution or facility raids, we know about all of it." The revelation that her entire undercover operation had been compromised from the beginning was devastating. Not only had she failed to gather useful evidence against Caldwell's organization, but she had potentially endangered Agent Sullivan and any other federal personnel involved in the investigation. "The question now," Caldwell said, "is whether You want to continue serving an investigation that has already failed, or whether you're willing to consider alternatives that might actually benefit the community you're trying to protect. As Claire sat in Vincent Caldwell's office, surrounded by evidence of her mission's failure and facing a choice between collaboration and elimination, she realized that her story had led to a moment that would define not just her own fate, but the future of everyone in Millbrook. The decision she made in the next few minutes would determine whether she became an accomplice to the very crime she'd tried to expose, whether she accepted elimination rather than compromise her principles, or whether there was some third option that her exhausted mind hadn't yet considered. Outside Caldwell's windows, the town of Millbrook continued its daily routines, unaware that the fate of their community was being decided in a conversation between a criminal mastermind and a limping cook who had stumbled into circumstances far beyond her preparation or understanding. But as Claire looked into Vincent Caldwell's pale eyes and saw the absolute conviction that he was offering her salvation rather than damnation, she realized that the most dangerous criminals were often those who had convinced themselves they were heroes, and the most important choices were often made by ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances, forced to decide whether survival was worth the cost of their souls. "Mr. Caldwell," Claire said finally, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her, "my mama didn't really die, did she?" Caldwell smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "No, Miss Patterson. Dorothy Patterson is very much alive and waiting at home for her daughter to return safely from work." "Then she was right about something she always told me," Claire continued, rising from her chair with the dignity that had carried her through every challenge life had presented. "She said that when someone offers you everything you want, that's usually when you need to be most careful about what you're willing to give up to get it." The conversation that followed would determine whether Claire Patterson walked out of Vincent Caldwell's office as an accomplice, a victim, or something else entirely. But whatever happened next, she had finally understood the true nature of the choice she'd been asked to make, not between right and wrong, but between different definitions of what it meant to save the people you love. And in that understanding, the limping cook from Murphy's Diner found the strength to face whatever consequences her decision would bring, knowing that some choices are more important than their outcomes, and that courage is often less about winning than about refusing to surrender the things that make victory worth achieving. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.